I am Associate Professor Darshini Aiton, and I am chairing our panel today. And as Sophia did allude to, I started doing this before it was named anything, because basically I am qualitatively trained, and so I was always like, should we ask the patient? Should we find out what they need and what they think about what we're doing? And even if we think statistically something works, did they like it? Are they actually going to do it once it transitions out of a trial phase? And so I started doing this, and then as soon as it became formalised, we gained more momentum around this because it became part of grant requirements, right? And all of a sudden we were being told we needed to write consumer and community involvement in 2 pages in our grant applications, and there were lots of guidance documents coming through. But what I really want, and I hope that you will get out of our conversation today, is not the you have to do this, but that you want to do this. And a little bit more around the heart of why consumer and community involvement is incredibly valuable, beneficial, and is actually going to impact how and why you deliver trials for patient benefit. And I'm also speaking as a consumer. I have enough autoimmune conditions to fill one hand. I'm hoping not to go into the second hand. But this is important for me from that perspective as well. So as our panellists come up on the stage, you can come, and we will get this conversation started. At the end of the questions that I have posed, because I know them and have stalked them, and have posed particular questions, you also will get some time to ask questions via an app. So just keep that in mind. Write down the questions. I feel like I'm fading in and out, but write down the questions that you might have, and please do ask them. So there'll be time at the end for that. Thank you. I'm going to turn this microphone on. Am I on? Yes? Perfect. Okay, hang on. Got to switch to an iPad. All right. Multitasking at its best. So thank you, all of you, for saying yes, for joining us up here. I'm going to start with you, Alison. Thank you so much. Alison is one of our consumer consultants for the Monash University Clinical Trials Centre, and you have extensive experience being a consumer in research, and I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about what benefits you have seen from involving consumers in research.
Would you like some of my background first?
Sorry, I forgot the introductions. You're meant to introduce yourself, but Sophia kind of introduced you. But no, please tell us your who and your what.
My who and my why. Well, professionally, I'm a registered nurse. I'm a melanoma survivor from about 10 years ago. Originally, I got into support and information for melanoma patients. However, the last 5 years or so, my focus has been on melanoma research. So I chair a couple of organisations, and I'm a consumer representative with some others. I won't go into all of them. And I also sit on the Cancer Council Australian Melanoma Guidelines panel and their management committee. I've co-authored a number of publications with leading clinicians. I've been an AI on 12 successful clinical trials or studies. At the moment, I'm a CI on one, and I think the highlight for me was in 2022, 23, the MRFF for the first time was taking applications for consumer-led research. So I headed those up with the Australian Centre of Excellence in melanoma imaging and diagnosis. I guess for me, the bottom line is that I'm passionate about improving outcomes for melanoma patients. That's my focus. And I think research is the key.
Amazing. Before I get you to answer your question, we might go down the line.
Yes.
So, Al, over to you.
Thanks, Dash, and thank you for having me here today. So I am a consumer in the sense that I live with type 1 diabetes. I've had it for 11 years and I've held various roles advocating for people in my age cohort at a state and federal level. Professionally, I work in therapeutic goods regulation across the whole sort of product life cycle with the federal government at the TGA. And I have a background in intellectual property and technology law, focusing on commercialisation of IP related to health tech. So I've worked for a number of multinational companies in-house and some healthcare adjacent companies in private practice and in-house. I also have had a research focus at various junctures, most recently working on looking at living evidence guideline development and incorporating consumer perspectives and lived experience into living evidence guidelines with Cochrane Australia. So I suppose they're the sort of pillars, academic, professional and personal. That's why I'm here today.
Thanks, Al. Over to you, Angela.
Thanks, Dash. Well, first of all, I'm definitely the least distinguished member of this panel, so it's very humbling to be in this company. I'm Angela Chan. I work for a pharmaceutical company called Bristol Squibb, and we develop and manufacture medicines for cancer, heart disease, and other types of illnesses. I've been part of the pharmaceutical company for 13 years. I've seen many medicines go from the clinical trial development stage all the way through to publicly funded access for Australian patients. So my industry designs, sponsors, runs many of the trials that are available for patients. So the reason I'm here is really to provide that personal perspective that's based on that industry experience.
Perfect. Trisha.
Hi, I'm Trish Peel. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. So my background is I'm an infectious diseases doctor, but I'm also a researcher and I look at how we can improve the outcomes for patients undergoing surgery. So work with surgeons, anaesthetists, nurses and increasingly with consumers. So my focus is twofold. First is doing clinical trials, so looking at how we can prevent infections, and increasingly also looking at, once we've done the trials, how do we put that into action? So how do we translate that? And part of that, probably through knowing Dash for a number of years, has been increasingly on engaging consumers both in the trial design but also in the translation, and then how do we educate and empower our consumers? So it's really exciting to be here today.
Thank you. And Eric.
Thanks, Dash. Thanks, Dash, and it's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation, Sophia. So I'm Eric Morand. I'm a MD, PhD rheumatologist. For those who don't know what a rheumatologist is, and actually we've done a national survey and no one knows what a rheumatologist is. It's a medical specialist in arthritis and autoimmune disease. My background as a researcher originally, although I'm a clinician, was actually leading laboratory research programs in rheumatoid arthritis. As Sophia's helpfully pointed out, I have had a long career and I've had the opportunity to see the incredible benefits that new technologies have brought to patients with diseases like rheumatoid arthritis. Totally transformed that disease in my lifetime. And we're desperate for those same benefits to be found in other diseases where, despite similar opportunities, that has not been the case. And now my group mostly studies the disease lupus, which is another autoimmune disease where big breakthroughs have been very elusive. And we've realised that actually we need to work outside the lab and in the clinic to understand better how to do trials in lupus, because many trials have failed. So I'm actually have the great privilege of working with Dash on a program to reinvent outcome measures for registrational trials for lupus. How did we get to do that? And when no one gave us permission or authority, we just decided it needed to be done and no one else was doing it, so we just got on with it. But patient involvement has been a huge part of that. I'm sure we'll come to that on the panel discussion, but we've kind of had a bit of an epiphany about 10 years ago when we understood, we did a little study of patient priorities in lupus versus physician priorities, and we found no overlap in the top five priorities of patients and the top 5 priorities of patients, physicians. So we now understand not only that we should involve patients, but that we must, and that our work would be better because of it.
Amazing. Thank you for your honesty there too. So back to you, Alison, for that first question I posed a little bit too early. But yes, now we actually know your extensive experience in consumer involvement and incredible grant applications as well and publications. So my question was, what benefits have you seen in involving consumers in research?
Well, overall, I think they've become more patient-centred, which is good. But there are some other observations that I'd like to make. I've noticed that there's an improved relevance that's aligning with the patient's real-life experiences and their priorities. And I'd just like to say too that researchers are very curious people and they might have a fantastic question that they'd like to put into a clinical trial, but that's not necessarily a patient's priority. So that's where they need to work with us to see if this is going to be able to recruit well, is it addressing what a patient really needs? So I would make that's my first observation. I also think there's been increased transparency. Most clinical trials are in one way or another taxpayer funded. They may be pharma sponsored. However, the patients are seen in the public health system, and they're of course taxpayer funded as well. I guess I've noticed too there's more diverse perspectives coming into the picture and lived experiences that have been taken into account too. So it's, like I said, it's not so much the researchers leading the research anymore, it's in collaboration. There's definite partnerships between them and the patients.
Excellent. And I guess building on that, Al, over to you. From your perspective, why is meaningful, and we see this word a lot in grant guidelines, meaningful consumer and community involvement important?
Yeah, thanks, Dash. I think there's a couple of different dimensions to this. I'm conscious that the terminology meaningful is often used in grant applications, and I think there's sort of there's two key aspects that we should be focusing on here. I mean, the first is we can talk about consumer involvement from a level of abstraction, considering things like the ethical implications, the respect that it confers on research subjects and people who will hopefully be the beneficiaries of the research. But I think there's also there's an acknowledgement of the practical benefits that can flow from actual consumer engagement and involvement. And the question, it makes me think of a couple of months ago, I attended the ARCS conference up in Sydney, and Professor Karen Woolley had recently done some research into I suppose the practical aspects of consumer involvement and how that affects the quality of resulting research. And it was interesting to hear that there's a much higher rate of sort of citation. Those publications are often published in higher impact journals. There's a lower rate of retraction. And these are some of the practical aspects that I think we should be taking into consideration, along with the ethical dimensions to consumer involvement, that together combine to make this a meaningful enterprise.
That's a really interesting point, and I didn't realise that, so definitely going to look that up. But I know increasingly publications are asking for a statement now. How have you involved the patient and the public in your work, which is what everyone else calls this work. Us in Australia, we like consumer and community involvement. So I can see how that would be of relevance. So thanks for sharing that. Now over to you, Angela. There are many ways to engage with patients to incorporate their input as you plan a clinical trial. Just wondering from your perspective, what does consumer engagement in clinical trials look like at a pharma biotech company such as Bristol Myers Squibb?
Yeah, so at Bristol Myers Squibb, we do have a formal mechanism for engagement. It's called the Patient Expert Engagement Resource. The patient is the expert, so I really like that title. It's a systematic way whereby we can engage with patient advocacy organisations to get that important feedback on clinical trials and on medicines that are going through clinical development. So the engagement with patient advocacy groups is actually mandatory for all phase 3 clinical trials. And I am aware of examples where that feedback from the patient organisations has resulted in, inclusion criteria of trial protocols being modified and in more patient-friendly clinical trial documents being generated as well.
Amazing. And I will say that in some of the trials I've run, I don't know if we should disclose this, but ChatGPT is very good at simplifying some of those patient documents because, as you alluded to, researchers are weird and we sometimes write in a way no one else can understand.
Yes, but I do want to say, I just want to add in there, yes, that's true, it can get very scientific, but then the researchers should be able to do quite a good lay summary.
They should. They should.
Yes.
My call to action for all of you. Tricia, why did you start involving consumers in your research, and what did you learn that may have taken you by surprise?
Yeah, so I work in infectious diseases and I was seeing patients who had quite nasty resistant infections. And I had a patient come to see me who was young and devastated because he was afraid to pick up his child because he was worried he was going to pass the infection on to his child. And I looked into it and wanted to know what education he'd received, what we'd talked to him about, how we'd engaged him in this process because he'd been in hospital for a long period of time. And so then roped Dash into a project where we went and actually engaged and interviewed patients who were in hospital with these infections. And I thought we'd find that they wanted this information, they wanted it in certain parts, but actually probably one of the most standout findings for us was actually the patients weren't getting their food because people were afraid to go into the room, so they'd have their food left outside. And by the time the food would come in, it was, hospital food is never really palatable, but cold hospital food is just diabolical. So by the time they got the food, they just couldn't eat it. And these were very sick patients who needed their nutrition. So, we also found they wanted the information, but really that thinking about, the whole patient, thinking about providing food, all those things was really amazing. So through that we then began to do education processes so that the staff knew how to deliver the food safely and to make sure staff were getting the food, but also providing information for the patient, working out the way that was digestible for their patient. Sorry, that's pardon the pun, but information for them at different stages, but also how the staff could educate the patients as well. So that was that was my sort of first true foray into consumer work, and really quite a eye-opening and amazing piece of work that we did.
And what I love about doing consumer work, and that is a great example, is you go in with one question and you come out with a totally different answer that you were not expecting. And that is the sign of good consumer and community involvement. So now over to you, Eric. So you, as we have heard, work at the intersection between clinical research and industry. How have you done consumer and community involvement across these roles?
Thanks, Dash. Yeah, I'll start from the point that I made earlier about, our kind of learning that we were getting it wrong with our priorities as physicians. Well, not wrong, but incomplete. I guess at first we grappled with the idea that, well, we're just getting this completely wrong. But the patient dimension is just a different dimension. Neither are wrong, both are right, but they are not the same. We actually did a study of physician-recorded disease activity versus patient-recorded disease activity, and no correlation. So we're just more and more evidence that these things are separate. And then you have to make, I guess, a value judgment that they are equally important, and just decide to treat them that way. In this new endpoint discovery project that we're doing, we are, of course, driven by requirements. So a new endpoint for a clinical trial will need to be approved by regulators. And notwithstanding the science that we hope we're doing well, the final audience for this basically is the FDA. Because if the FDA doesn't approve the endpoint, it won't be used in a trial. And if it's not approved by the FDA, it's not won't happen anywhere else either. So the FDA and related organisations have published many guidelines on this. And the key phrase, which you've heard me say many times in our meetings, Dash, is, do you measure something which impacts on how the patient feels, functions, or survives? And this catchphrase just comes up over and over again. And once you've heard yourself say it a few times, you start to realise that it's really important. And how the patient feels is not something that doctors are any good at measuring, actually. Only the patient can tell us. So having that information and knowing that it was absolutely a requirement gave us a sort of definitive reason that we must do this, even though we already pretty much thought it was a good idea. And the input that we've received from the patients has been just amazing. Can I give little example? So the disease that we're studying, lupus, one of the major patient symptoms is fatigue. This is something which comes out in survey after survey. And actually tools to measure this and tools to measure change in this are not bad, but actually it's hard to measure. We assumed, involving patients, that they would vote for fatigue to be part of our new measure, but they didn't. Actually, many of the physicians did, but the patients voted it down, to our great surprise. And the reason they did was because in their lived experience, they can be in remission, but still fatigued. And so they said, this won't help you in working out whether your drug worked, so don't do it. So, I mean, the scientific detail of the Delphi consensus process was a bit more complicated than that, but that was basically the outcome. So it surprised us in many interesting ways.
Amazing example. And I am also curious as to whether or not the physicians put fatigue in there because they were anticipating the patients wanted it.
Yeah, well, we're trying to be as woke as possible.
What?
Right? We're trying to be alive to what we perceive the concerns of the community to be.
Yeah, amazing. Now, Alison, back to you. Very curious, if someone was coming up to you to invite you to be a consumer in a project, what do you look for when saying yes to being a consumer in research?
I'm a bit picky.
Yeah, good.
Well, first of all, the research has to have a clear purpose. It's no point. I don't like waffly things. It has to be clear, and there has to be a clear outcome of what they're looking for. I do look at the ethical standards they'll be employing, and that the patient's interests will be protected. Equipoise is extremely important to me. I don't want to see any patient disadvantaged by going on a clinical trial. I look to see if the trial is going to change the standard of care, because that's really important. What's the point of doing our clinical trials if we're not changing anything? We really, that's one of the main ones actually, if it's going to change the standard of care. And then at the same time, it's not going to disadvantage the patients who are already receiving the standard of care. Does that make sense? So you've got your experimental arm and the current standard of care. The other, I do scrutinise how much input I'll have into the decision-making process. I'm well beyond being a school teacher when I'm reviewing research proposals, punctuation, grammar. I'm not interested. I will do it, but I mean, I'm not, I'm not really, that's not my scene anymore. And I want to know that any contributions I make will be respected and will hopefully be incorporated, or if they're not incorporated, it'll be explained why they won't be, and then you can understand more. And I will look also if there's going to be a benefit to the wider community. That's really important. I would like to say, just going back to the first comment about, checking punctuation and grammar, there's a conference, we're in September. So in October, there's the big Australasian Melanoma Conference in Sydney, and I'll be leading the debate on is consumer input just a tick in the box exercise. And on one side we'll have our consumers, and on the other side we'll have our researchers and clinicians, and they'll be arguing the opposite of what they actually do. So that will be really interesting.
That's awesome.
Yeah, but finally I would like to say I would like to see this become consumer involvement and engagement part of the research cycle, and that maybe we won't have to have events like this. It's just part and parcel, just like when you do a clinical trial, you have a biostatistician involved or an epidemiologist. So that's my hope for the future.
I love that vision for the future. That's excellent.
Some great questions here.
Okay. How am I going for time? Good. So I've still got questions in my lineup. All right, okay. But keep me on time because I have no concept of it. And so I'm going to now go to Al, because we've now heard from Alison what to look for, but what helps from a consumer perspective, being a consumer in research, and what gets in the way.
Thanks, Dash. I think, it can be a rewarding but sometimes a challenging role being a consumer in the room, especially if you're involved in a project where you may not necessarily have subject matter specific expertise beyond lived experience of the condition, which obviously is important, valuable form of knowledge. So I think one thing that can really help consumers is to be clued in, to have some understanding of, the research process, to have obviously done your homework, to know enough to be dangerous. And from the perspective of clinicians or researchers, it is really helpful to have some sort of background in consumer engagement. Even if it's things as simple as, understanding the language around, how to, in my case, best refer to people with type 1 diabetes and that sort of thing, not referring to people as diabetics, But, that also goes to one thing that I've seen crop up as a bit of a barrier to collaboration sometimes, and that is people not seeing the wood for the trees. I think there are a lot of people in the advocacy space who have very trenchant, staunch views, and that's important. And, we need people who are going to move the needle. But there's also a time and a place to moderate your approach to advocacy. And I think it's really important that people approach consumer engagement from the perspective of collaboration and looking to be reading from the same hymn sheet, as opposed to establishing an oppositional dynamic, which I sometimes see emerge, not in any of the projects I've been involved in recently, but I think when maybe 5 or so years ago, when consumer involvement was in its sort of nascent stages, and there wasn't the same appreciation for the value of that input as there is now, I saw a bit more tension there. So I think having that attitude of collaboration goes a long way.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. I'm glad we've moved along, but it is something to keep in mind. And I think particularly when we're new into a space, to not feel threatened and that the consumer is the other. The consumer is working with you, and it's a partnership and it's a relationship. It's really important. Angela, you had mentioned, which I didn't know, that having consumers is mandatory. So I'm changing your question because my question was initially how important it is, and you've told me it's mandatory. What happens then if a trial comes your way and they haven't involved consumers? What's the process?
So when I say it's mandatory, I mean that the trial actually won't be signed off by the senior leadership of the company.
Wow,
That sit in Princeton Pike in the US. So it's way above us as a country level. This is a standard that has been set by the leaders of the company to say this is how important it is to consult. Yeah.
And how long has that been in play?
It was put in place in 2020, I believe.
Wow, that's awesome.
Okay. I think it's a natural progression. We routinely consult clinicians on trials, right, Eric, to ensure that what we're doing is clinically relevant. And so it just makes sense that we would listen to the people who have that experience of living with the disease and who are going to take our medicines. Because these are perspectives that we don't necessarily have about disease burden, the burden of taking the treatment or the clinical trial visits, also the treatment preferences of the patient. And these are perspectives that can be used to improve the experience of patients, not only on clinical trials, but with our medicines.
Yeah.
So it is very important.
Excellent. There's a related question.
Is there a timeline for when patients engage throughout their trial participation at Bristol Myers Squibb? What are the most important time points?
Can you repeat the question so everyone can hear that?
Is there a timeline for when patients are engaged throughout their trial participation at Bristol Myers Squibb? What's the most important time points and why?
So the engagement is actually planned really early in development before any trials are done in patients. That starts off very high level because, as you can probably understand, in the development of a medicine, it can be very fluid at that very early stage before it even gets to trial. You don't know if it's actually got to get all the way through. And then really the formal engagement really kicks off at the first in-human or phase 1 stage, where they're seeking that feedback on the trial protocol, the inclusion criteria, informed consent, how many visits, how many injections, that sort of thing. And then again, there's that formal touch point at phase 3. And then there are also other touch points through to commercialisation as well, when we're actually bringing the medicine to the patient, to all the patients, not just the ones who are part of the clinical trial.
So throughout the cycle, throughout the whole process. Thank you. Can I move on to Trish? Yeah. So Trish, this is a question adapted by Brene Brown, from Brene Brown, I should say. What has been a piece of advice, information you received about consumer and community involvement that was either really, really good that you have to share it with us, or really, really bad that you also have to warn us against it?
I think it's human nature that you always think about the really, really bad things. So I think one thing we're grappling with, I think clinicians and researchers are still learning how best to partner, and I think it's an evolving process. I'm hoping that as researchers we've matured in how we engage and interact and have that partnership with consumers. Where I think we're still learning is then as clinicians, how do we work with consumers, our patients, their caregivers, their families, and I think that's where we're learning. And perhaps, although I don't think it is necessarily unique to the area I work in, which is working in surgery with surgeons, and ETHIT is a very multidisciplinary team where there can be quite strong hierarchies and at times a slightly paternalistic approach. One of the things we've come up against is engaging consumers and engaging them in discussions about infection prevention. There's a lot of pushback from clinicians and some clinicians have said, well, it's too complex for the patient to understand. Why do we need to do this work? We just tell them what they need to know. So I think that's again, probably, hopefully with the changing landscape in research and then the changing landscape in clinical practice, perhaps that will change. But there has been that paternalistic view that medicine is complex, that we tell patients what they need to know, and that the patients, can't make that decision or can't have that meaningful interaction and shared decision making with us.
Al has something to say.
I just wanted to add, I think it's a really difficult tension that sort of I also see play out in the law, and I think it happens across a number of different professions. At law school, you're sort of taught that there are the lawyers and then and the judges and the lay people, and this arcane area of knowledge has to be translated, and there are legitimate aspects to that. So I think this is where it's one of these inflection points where we can sort of lose sight of the fact that there is real complexity to medicine and medical practice, and there certainly is a place for instruction and education, because patients don't know everything. As I say, this is somebody living with type 1 diabetes in the type 1 diabetes community, because there are a lot of consumer-made medical devices and that kind of thing. Oftentimes, patients do have a high degree of engagement with their condition, and they are actually experts. But I just thought it'd be worth acknowledging that there is that tension there. But it's been brilliant to see a more sort of evolved understanding of how consumers and clinicians and experts can collaborate.
Can I just add to that? Because we were talking about this before we started. I'm in the melanoma sphere, and I've never encountered... there haven't been too many tensions at all between us. I think it's been respectful, it's been friendly, and I'm not there to criticise their work. I want to work with them, and I've found the researchers feel the same way.
Yeah.
So that's melanoma. I don't know with other diseases, but
it might be illustrative to offer an example. So in the type 1 diabetes space, for the longest time there weren't adequate commercially available solutions for insulin delivery pump technology, and we ended up in this interesting situation where people were prepared to manufacture DIY in their backyard, effectively, hybrid closed loop insulin infusion technology. So a combination of like a small...
We hacked our systems.
Yeah, we hacked, so there was this whole movement of like biohacking, and what emerged out of that was this interesting sort of tension between citizen scientists who were desperate for a solution that was adequate for their needs. Initially, it was parents who wanted insulin infusion technology that would take care of their kids overnight.
Not overnight.
And there was a lot of pushback from clinicians, endocrinologists, and that sort of thing. Understandably, because that people are using technologies that they can't vouch for. Oftentimes, these systems would incorporate out of warranty medical devices as well, because they were the ones that you could hack because they had the requisite vulnerabilities. And so that's an interesting example of where those sort of tensions have played out.
Great example.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to throw to Eric with our last question. And then it's all going to come over to you. So if you haven't entered a question, please enter so now. It's up there. Eric, based on this conversation, actually, how do we make consumer and community involvement part of usual practice for the next generation of clinicians and researchers and people coming through doing this work?
Great question, Dash. And although we've come a long way, we still have quite a long way to go, I think. I think you just have to get out there and tell people how great it is, how good it feels, as a researcher to have that authentic input from patients, which can be very validating. You think, oh, I wonder if they're going to like this, and they do. Like, that's great. You get an affirmation, and then you also get corrections for things, places where you're going wrong, and it just improves it. And who are we there for, actually? Why are we doing this research? We're doing it for ourselves? Well, we're not supposed to be doing it for ourselves. We're supposed to be doing it for the community. And so, nothing about me without me, right? I think we just have to keep talking the talk and leading from the front, leading by example.
Yes.
And people will follow. Build it and they'll come.
100%. But back also to Alison's point, we will have statisticians and epidemiologists and clinicians on our trials. And I remember going through my Master of Public Health and almost failing, Rory, your unit. Because I'm not very good at statistics, but it was a mandatory unit. We do not have mandatory units on consumer and community involvement as part of our research training. It's coming. But, I do think we need to keep having these conversations. We need to be showing the benefit and the value and the how of doing this well. So I think the more we integrate this into our teaching and our conversation, the better. Now I'm looking over.
I just want to say too, it's up to the leaders too, who are currently like Eric, to pass on that experience and those positive experiences to their emerging, to their more junior people, because they look up to you and they'll want to. You need to be a role model for them.
Which is actually incredible, because I've seen Eric in action in these meetings, and how enthusiastic you are after those meetings with the patient advisory panel, and just being like, wow. And it is contagious. Like, it is contagious, and it makes it be like, yes. But Sophia has a question.
I just have to chip in with a little joke.
Okay.
It's a now deceased American comedian, George Burns, was interviewed once. He was like an irascible, crusty old bastard. And he was talking about show business, and he said the secret to success in this business is sincerity.
Yeah.
When you can fake that, you've got it made.
I don't think you fake it.
I don't think I fake it, right? But actually, when we're clinicians seeing patients, sometimes you're having a bad day. You still got to bring your best game, because you are there for them. And so it's not faking it, but it is actively, right, engaging it, even if it's not hardwired. You make a choice about how you are. And I think that's what we just need to keep doing.
Yeah, that is a great quote.
So my question was going to be about the how to the panel, because we've talked a bit about the why, and yes, it's mandatory. What are your views on, and often we get asked, is it one voice on a steering committee? Is it a separate consumer advisory committee? Particularly Al and Alison constantly being asked about which is the best approach. And obviously it's going to vary depending on the project. But can you give us, audience, a bit of insight as to what your views are on the how? How do we do it?
Who wants to go first?
I think you would speak to your colleagues about it, who are already quite engaged with their consumers. That would be one way, and then ask them how they got their consumers, to be involved. You could always, there's newsletters. I'm just thinking from a very basic level, but I think you need to talk to your colleagues.
Al?
I think just building on that, one of the best places to start is with engaging with consumers to inquire about forms of communication that work best for them, whether it's email, whether it's having... My experience has been that meeting face-to-face is often the most productive, even if that's over Zoom. But I think having too many layers of bureaucracy in the form of steering committees and all that sort of thing, you can lose some of the granularity, lose some of the detail. So I haven't... I think if you give people the opportunity to communicate directly with key decision makers in a way that is either can facilitate conversation with other people or is, direct and private. And you create an ambience and an environment in which people know that their views are going to be taken seriously. You can't really go wrong, I don't think.
And I do this quite a bit, and in particular work with people who have lived experience of dementia or are living with cognitive impairment, and I always ask, what is the best way for me to communicate around meetings? And for some of them, they say, give me a phone call beforehand, chat about the agenda, send me the documents beforehand. For others, they're like, can you call me after the meeting because I may not have said or thought quickly enough to contribute during the meeting what I thought. And so everyone has their own ways and being. I would say too on a committee, often I really appreciate it having a consumer committee of like 5 and above, because the bouncing off of ideas and what you bring to the table, which might be different experiences, is really valuable. But I'll also see, do you guys have any questions that we haven't covered? Yeah, use the microphones.
Yeah, the first question, what are the feedback opportunities for patients post-trial?
Well, we might ask Trisha and Eric and then come to you guys, Al and Alison as well, and Angela. What do you guys do post-trial?
So I think I'll start with a real disclaimer. I'm still learning how to best do this. So my approach at the moment has been when a participant has completed the trial, we get feedback about what their process was like, what worked for them, what we could improve, how we could better engage them in the process. And so that's something that we're learning how to do. And then also looking at the broader network about the patients who are going to be impacted by the trial and how can we disseminate and engage them in the implementation and also information giving for them. But again, definitely learning still.
And it's almost a whole other study post-trial, to be honest. But Eric, any thoughts from you on that?
So many. So just a list, really. So one of the ways is to write a separate paper to your trial in lay language or community-facing language, which actually a trial I was involved with BMS just published the phase 2 trial results in a public-facing way. Second way is to engage with the community of patients because you're doing it all the time. So when there's a new result to talk about, you already got that meeting upcoming because it's a regular thing, and you say, here's what happened, what do you think? Get the feedback. You need patient involvement, at least in the Australian and many other systems, reimbursement. The trial's not over. The patient can't access the product until it's reimbursed. And patient involvement in making representations to payers, governments is super important. And how can you help people to do that unless you've been with them in all the trial and post-trial journey? So there's just a gigantic list of important contributions that patients make to the whole ecosystem.
Yeah. Alison, Al, anything to add as to what has worked post-trial for you guys?
I think this is where the advocacy organisations really come into play. When pharma go to put their submissions into the PBAC, if working with the advocacy organisations, the support and advocacy organisations, they've got a whole patient network that they can tap into, and they can put out, we're interested in your comments. Why is this drug so important to you? And then they can put in the organisation itself can put in a submission to the PBAC. Yeah, that's another good way.
One way I've seen this work well in terms of ongoing touch points after consumer engagement is after I was involved in developing these living guidelines around the use of technology in type 1 diabetes management. I think as Eric mentioned, we actually published a separate paper that sort of interrogated the consumer involvement aspect of that project. And that was a nice way of just sort of revisiting what worked, perhaps areas for improvement. Yeah, but I think even if it can be something as simple as just communicating results, that sort of thing, giving people the acknowledging the contribution and helping people to understand where their contribution ended up.
Yeah.
I think that's really helpful.
Thanking them for
closing the loop.
participating. Yeah.
Angela, did you have anything to add?
I think I might pick up where you've seen the results and what happens after that, because this is an area that my colleague Hayley Anderson really has done some excellent work in creating lay descriptions about the steps that are required of getting those from that positive clinical trial results through to funded access for patients, providing lay descriptions of what is the actual submission to the government asking for in terms of reimbursement, and then that enables patient organisations to submit their comments, right, about whether they want medicine funded or not and why it's important to them. And then beyond that, it's about getting that input from patient advocacy organisations in the development of materials for patients beyond the clinical trial who are going to use your medicine, so that you are actually developing something that is accessible and also relevant for the people who are using it.
Great answer. Sophia, did you have a question? Or there's more questions.
What is the difference between community engagement and community involvement in research?
Community engagement and community involvement. I think my 2 cents is we just use these terms interchangeably.
Yeah.
And so I would say they're the same, but I don't know if anyone disagrees. I would say there's a difference between co-design and consumer and community involvement.
Maybe one implies a slightly more passive role. Engagement is just information sharing. Involvement is a bit more two-way, perhaps.
Perhaps. But I don't know if the people using it always appreciate that.
Yeah.
So I hope that answers your question.
Here's a good one, Dash.
Oh, goodness.
Is there a danger that consumer involvement could exacerbate inequality? For example, only certain consumers are able to engage or seen as valuable, or certain diseases prioritised?
Trisha.
Yeah, I think it's important. I mean, just reflecting back on my area of work, so I work in how do you prevent infections, and I look at how you do that in Australia and high-income countries, but also then looking at low and middle-income countries. But most of the clinical trials that have been done and all of the consumer work that's been done largely, although there is an increasing focus, has been done in high-income countries. So, the trials are developed from that high-income country viewpoint and framework. And so then how does that translate to low and middle income countries where actually the vast majority of actual patients who are undergoing surgery exist? So I think you can potentially disadvantage those groups of consumers and patients because you haven't actually taken their viewpoint into consideration in your trial development. I think it speaks to the fact that you need to have that broad and think about who are you actually impacting and who you involve.
And Eric, did you have any other thoughts on that?
This will surprise you, but no.
I'm trying to get through as many questions. Is
Sorry,
there any other?
can I
Go,
pipe in
Angela.
here? I like to look at it from a slightly different angle, which is when you get consumer involvement in clinical trials, it usually results in something that's more accessible and more relevant to patients, and therefore, theoretically, it should increase the inclusion and the diversity of your clinical trial participants. So I think there's that angle or that way to look at it as well.
The diversity is important, yeah.
And I would say that even with the consumers that I have worked with, they often will speak on behalf of others, not just themselves.
Yeah.
And so they will bring that perspective, this isn't my story, but I know this would be a problem if we were wanting to recruit patients from this group or this area, for example, and that's been really valuable. But next question, Jonathan.
How do you ensure you capture broad and diverse consumers' involvement with culturally and linguistically diverse First Nation people and people with disabilities?
Eric, and then Al.
Yeah, this is super important, obviously, in the place that we live and work in. Working at Monash in Clayton, I think there's 140 different languages spoken by our patients. So we have to be mindful of the communication challenges, but also the cultural differences, health literacy, health acceptance, people from countries that have had bad experiences with authority have a different attitude to what they perceive to be a hierarchical medical system. That's the one they've seen before. In terms of First Nations Australians, we've got a big project looking at lupus in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. It's very common and very severe in that community. But actually there are many barriers to doing this research for good reasons, but actually they are a problem. You must constitute a panel, including community representation. Good. Now the panel must include a First Nations origin researcher, and actually there's not enough of them to go around. So there's a requirement for that, and that everybody's already on 25 panels and they just can't do any more. And so, of course, at Monash we are training the next generation. We're very proud of our enrolment of high numbers of First Nations Australians in all of our courses, including medicine. But until those people are out in the field, actually we've almost created an obstacle for ourselves, and I don't quite know the way around that, to be honest.
Yeah, good point. Al, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Oh, I was just going to say Diabetes Victoria is an organisation that's done an especially good job, I think, of ensuring that consumer advisory committees reflect the complexion of society, including a strong focus on incorporating First Nations voices. But it, as Eric was saying, it comes down to the communications challenge and ensuring that at the outset you've already done a level of consultation with the community to understand what the most effective ways of communicating with various cohorts are before, putting things out like a call for applications and and that sort of thing. Because if that thinking hasn't been done beforehand, it's too late by the time that recruitment begins.
Yeah.
Another question is, for what types of outcomes is the consumer involvement more important?
Oh. What types of outcomes is consumer involvement more important?
What sort of outcomes? Well, something that's going to improve their life. Sometimes it's life or death, isn't it? It can be that basic. Yeah.
I think the other thing I reflect on is often your trial protocol and what you're asking the patient to do to be part of said trial, how much monitoring you need. I know I was part of a trial that required me to get blood tests a lot. And it took out so much time in my day that I dropped out. But no one came to me to ask, why did you drop out? I was just a patient who dropped out of said trial. No one said... I had no opportunity to say getting bloods done that often was too hard for me to maintain amongst everything else I do.
Well, that's where the consumer can come in.
Yeah.
In the trial design. For example, there's one that's happening now at Peter Mac. They're looking at the microbiome diversity with people who are having immunotherapy, and what would be an acceptable number of fecal samples would people provide?
Ooh,
would it be
question.
Every week? Would it be, would there be certain points? And that, I said I don't think every week's going to work.
No.
So, yeah.
Yeah. I hope that answers.
And that can aid in recruitment and keeping people, engaged with it so they don't drop out.
I think the question might presume that there is a fixed set of outcomes and that the consumer involvement has to correspond with one of those outcomes where, Dash, we were talking about this before. I think one of the benefits of consumer engagement or patient partnership is that consumers can be involved in defining the outcomes.
Yeah.
that can be extremely beneficial, I think. Yeah.
And then we just leave it to people like Andrew Forbes and Rory Wolf to work out how to do the stats on that. Any other questions? How are we going for time? Am I getting 10 minutes? Awesome. So we've got some quick fire rounds depending on how many questions you've got.
Next question. Should consumers be expected to contribute pro bono their involvement in research, or should they be paid?
Go for it.
When I'm asked to be a consumer, I must say I do not look to see if I'm going to be remunerated. That's not high on my list of priorities at all. It is nice, it is a recognition, it's respectful that what I'll bring to the table is going to be worthwhile. So yes and no, but I have met consumers who'll only take on paying roles, which shocked me a little bit. Yeah, so I'm not. I mean, I think it's good, but it's not mandatory for me.
Yeah,
it has to interest me. The topic.
That's
first
more important. Yeah, Al.
Yeah, I think like with most of these things, it's hard to sort of talk about these things in generalities. It depends on the consumer, and I think the most important aspect of things is to consult with the consumer about what their expectations are and how they sort of expect to be involved or would like to be involved. I think it's very much a case-by-case basis. I must say, yeah, many years ago, I do remember quite a distinct feeling of disappointment, realising that, I contributed significantly to a particular project, was there volunteering my time, and it became acutely apparent at one point that every other person in the room was being paid to be there but me. And, there's a not insubstantial cost associated with living with a chronic disease. There's a lot of sort of sweat equity that goes into just getting by. And so it is, there is something validating about, having your lived experience, validated in that way. So, but it's complex. Yeah.
And I think for me, it's bringing an equity lens. Like if we want more diversity and more voices on our consumer involvement panels, we don't want it to be the people who can afford to do this pro bono. We do want to make sure that we will be able to support people who might need to leave work to participate, who might need childcare, who might need to travel, and as Al said, living with chronic health conditions can be an expensive business in Australia. Even though we have a universal medical system, we are out of pocket a lot. And sometimes when I've spoken to my consumers, and even from my own lived experience, they've said, "Oh, thank you so much. This has helped me pay for X." And I'm like, amazing. Like, that's really powerful. So something to think. But I'd also say there's other ways to acknowledge contribution of consumers, publications, being on grants, co-presenting at conferences, paying for them to come to conferences with you, paying for conference registrations. Think about other ways that you can build that relationship, but also that capacity and capability.
I'm very comfortable with that, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm going to review a document, I will spend, a couple of hours doing it. So, and I will make suggestions. So to be incorporated as a co-author or an AI, yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's recognition of the time I've spent.
Yeah.
I do think that's a wonderful form of recognition. I do also think that we need to be careful about, offering people forms of, acknowledgement or remuneration, whatever we call it, that don't have any particular cachet for those people, like in the sense that, it has currency within academia, but that it might not be relevant, to
Are you
somebody
saying
from a
it's
different
not on your
background.
CV, the papers you've written?
No.
But I take your point. Yeah, totally.
Okay, a question from Liz from Fortrea. What do you believe to be the greatest challenge for us as researchers and trial designers to ensure the future patient needs are met in a complex modern world?
Eric, that's a hard question. I'm going to you.
Oh, wow. Yeah, big question. What is the most important thing?
Do you want me to read the question
Yeah,
again?
could you read the question
Yes.
again? It was a long question.
What do you believe to be the greatest challenge
Greatest
for us as
challenge.
researchers and trial designers to ensure the future patient needs are met in a complex modern world?
I would say that the greatest challenge is from the huge range of research that it is possible to do, to choose the things to do that make the biggest difference in the shortest time. Many of us are focused as researchers on things that we are personally curious about, that we're interested in, but have we stopped to think about, are they going to make, how much difference will they make? There was a great presentation the other day actually at the Victorian Heart Institute Innovation Summit from a Monash academic who's come out of the Stanford system where they don't take on a research project in their medical faculty until they've first worked out, is this a big problem that's going to help a lot of people or help in a big way for a small number of people? If not, don't do it. Don't start. So I would think that my personal view, the most important thing is got limited resources. Let's use them in the most effective way.
Tricia?
I think one of the biggest challenges, both for clinicians and researchers, is just how rapidly the field of medicine is changing. In infectious diseases, we also have the bacteria and viruses that are suddenly changing as well. So trying to keep up with that, but also our traditional trial methodologies kind of lag a bit behind all of that. So how do we keep moving forward? How do we keep changing and adapting is the biggest challenge. And then how do we, ensure that we're always making the best possible, getting the best possible outcomes for our patients is challenging. It's such a diverse area. It's such a huge area.
Yeah.
If I could add to that a little example, I was at a conference last week in Madrid, lovely city, and someone was presenting a paper, and the paper had been published, but the comparator were drugs that are basically obsolete. And I couldn't believe it was on the grand stage at this major international meeting that, presumably because the esteemed authors were, well respected, that they still gave it an airing. But, everyone in the audience knew that those drugs were not going to be used anymore and that the research was obsolete. So we do have to keep ourselves honest, as we say, and really understand that, are we asking the right questions? Are they going to have the biggest impact? And if we've moved on, the field's moved on, got to let go and move forward, because we're not doing a service to our communities if we do that.
And I think it's coming back again to what we were talking about is this going to change the system of care? Is this going to change the way we practice going forward? Is this going to add value to our health system? And, if that's something that you're interested, Kathy's over there, who can give you some advice around, how do we assess that? How do we measure that in terms of health economics? But also, how is this important in terms of patient care and care paradigms? Susie?
Yep, great question. Researchers are often afraid of getting things wrong with engagement as it's not their expertise. What advice can you give them to help them not feel this way?
Alison?
Oh, this is one of my favourite ones. Don't be frightened of us. We don't bite. We're on your side, and just talk to us like normal people and explain your research to us. And and as you start to explain it, you might start off very basic, and then the depths will be it'll be like an onion. It'll be peeled back, and before you know it, you've got someone who's really engaged and is helping you.
Al?
Yeah, I think that's right. Just building on what Alison has said, I think it is also incumbent on consumers to not bite, because there are.
I don't bite.
Yeah, well, it goes to what we were discussing before around, people having really sort of trench and staunch views, and there's a place for that, but it's just really important that people don't assume that other people know certain things. Just approach the whole project with a spirit of collaboration and humility. I think that's really important.
And side note, short story long, no. When I got diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, it was very traumatic. And I was very, very angry. So what do I know for myself is I actually can't be a consumer in that space because I will bite. I will bite because I'm angry. I can be a consumer in other spaces, but I think there also comes a bit of self-awareness for myself to say, where is there still trauma and pain that I'm holding from that? And when am I ready to engage? And sometimes that is also ethical and moral practice for you as a researcher to check in with a consumer to find out, are they ready to engage? Because sometimes experiences of healthcare can be traumatising.
I think it's also that's incumbent on the consumer too. I mean, if you're just recently diagnosed or you're just getting over treatment, it's a very emotional time. I think, for want of a better description, you have to get your act together a bit before, so you're not waving this flag and being angry and whatnot. And also, it's not all about you anymore.
Yeah.
It's about representing the views of consumers in general.
How are we going for time? Do we have time for one more question?
Dash, I'll just add something to speaking to the researchers who are worried about it. Just give it a crack. What's the worst that can happen? Dash might get cross at you. I don't care.
You might have
seriously.
There might be tears.
People are people. Just
people are people.
Cross the Rubicon. It'll be fine.
Might have to buy them a coffee.
Yeah.
And I think you'll find they often have shared objectives with you. Also, speaking on the side of not researchers but industry, I see Jonathan in the room. I remember before my first meeting with him about a drugs shortage, I was incredibly nervous, thinking, gosh, every reason to be angry. But actually, when you are genuine and sincere in your engagement with consumers, you will find that they will be genuine and sincere with you. And they are also trying to help you with that shared objective, which is to get a good outcome for the community and for their patients.
I think that's a great note to end on. And so, I think ending on the note that we're all human, that kindness matters, relationship matters, and it's about transformation, not transaction. So can you join me in thanking our panel members today for their insights?